Hello, I'm Rosie Surdeville. I'm a local historian and I'd like to talk to you today about the hunger marches of the 1930s, and in particular about the number of women from Gateshead who were important as organisers as well as participants in those marches. Mention hunger marches these days and we all think of Jarrow in 1936, when 200 unemployed men marched to London to present a petition calling on Parliament to restore industry to their stricken hometown. The irony is that this, the most famous of the many hunger marches, was largely forgotten until the 1970s, when rising unemployment and Alan Price's song reminded us all of what had happened. These days, there's a memorial in Jarrow, a lovely bronze cast of a family clearly heading off to London, all of them united in their cause. Except, of course, that there were no women at all on the Jarrow March, apart, of course, from local MP Ellen Wilkinson, who joined them for part of the road. Hunger marches were nothing new. The first one took place in 1905. But we've come to associate them with the Great Depression of the 1930s. And women were very much a feature of these later marches, both as organisers and as participants. There's a reason why they and the marches that they were so heavily involved in have been pushed out of history at the expense of the Jarrow Crusade. You see, they were perceived as being dangerously radical. In comparison, Jarrow was seen as respectable. The organisers, many of them left-wingers and socialists themselves, had gone to some pains to make sure that Jarrow was supported by all political parties in the area, that the march was presented as being apolitical, and that it had the full support of religious groups in the time. Of course, that wasn't enough to stop them being denounced by the Bishop of Durham as dangerous revolutionaries. He actually wrote a letter to the Times about it, which is sort of funny when you look at what was actually going on in his area. The reason that they were being treated as so dangerous was because many of the other hunger marches had been organised by the National Unemployed Workers Movement. I'm going to refer to that as the NUWM from now on. This was a group that had many of its officers derived from the Communist Party and had been closely associated with the CP, the Communist Party, for most of its life. A previous incarnation of the organisation, set up in 1920 by local trades councils to advocate for their unemployed members, had been designed to lobby elective representatives about unemployment. But that had foundered. For many unemployed people, there was a sense that that earlier trade union organisation just wasn't really interested in what was happening to them. There was a feeling that the trade unionists and the Labour Party were concerned about people in work rather than those out of it. The NUWM grew rapidly, and it was almost entirely composed of those who were out of work themselves and who paid a penny a week as a kind of subscription, money that was used for organising and for their many programmes of works. At its peak, the organisation had about 50,000 members. It often took a radical approach. The idea for the NWM was to unify unemployed and employed to confront social injustice, to overthrow capitalism itself. This, they felt, was the only way to end unemployment and replace the wage system with payments based on rates determined by trade unions. The NUWM activity can be broken down into three main strands of work. First of all, there was the national activity, the campaign against unemployment, and in particular, the hated means test. That saw hunger marches in 1922, 23, 29, 1930, 32, 34, and 36. as you can see, a lot of very hard campaigning and organising would be involved there. The other thing that they did was to organise local demonstrations and lobbying of local councillors, of local councils and of labour exchanges. The idea was to protest about the treatment of the unemployed locally and to seek increases in relief in the benefit being paid to people. Because in the early stages, benefit levels were determined locally, you could get discrepancies. People living in one borough might find that they were actually entitled to more money than people living in the street next door, which happened to be in another borough. There were also issues like rent evictions, which saw very large demonstrations of the NUWM turning up not just to lobby the councils not to go ahead with this action, but to actually occupy the houses under threat to prevent the bailiffs getting in and actually removing the family and their furniture. The NUWM organised across the entire region. When Durham Public Assistance Committee refused to implement a 10% cut in benefits, the government sent commissioners in. And in response to that, people from Gateshead, Stockton and Middlesbrough went to Durham to campaign against the situation. The other bit of NUWM work that was really crucial was taking up individual cases, helping with claims and with representation at appeals tribunals. And that was hugely important because at that point, no welfare rights service existed. The Citizens Advice Bureau that so many people rely on today came into existence with the Second World War. Unless the unemployed could help each other to deal with problems with their benefit, they had no source of support. Women were an active presence in the NUWM right from the start. Lily Webb was appointed women's organiser in 1921. She was a Lancashire textile mill worker who went on to become a bus conductress and who became active in the Communist Party. And she lived in Gateshead for many years. Her husband was a full-time CP, Communist Party official in the area. She'd later move on to Burnley and would help to organise the 1932 Women's Hunger March, actually leading a contingent that marched from Burnley on that occasion. She tells us a great deal about what was going on in Gateshead during her time in the area. She describes 200 women, members of the National Unemployed Workers Committee movement, have formed a women's section in Gateshead. She says a distressed fund was formed after organising a deputation to the town hall. Women here are taking up their own labour exchange and Board of Guardians cases. The deputation that she mentions, which comprised a Mrs. Kirk, a Mrs. James and a Mrs. Coffey, had raised issues about the families of out-of-work men and about young women, also unemployed, who were not getting any benefit. It's very difficult to estimate the number of women who actually were on the unemployed registers in this period, largely because such efforts were made to take them off those registers. The official figures largely excluded them because they only recorded payments made. And very often, if you had a whole family unemployed, the payment would go to the husband. Most women who did work were domestic servants, and domestic servants were not recorded on the unemployed registers until 1936. In addition, we had a really nasty bit of legislation, the 1931 Anomalies Act. This invalidated any insurance contributions paid by a married woman after her marriage. Only those that she'd paid before her wedding counted. That had a devastating effect. On Tyneside, we know that about 1,200 women were struck off the unemployed register and lost any chance of getting benefits or relief when that happened. Nationally, we think the number of women who were pushed off the register must have been around 200,000. huge number of women affected by that bit of legislation. And campaigning against the Anomalies Act was something that many of the women's sections in the NUWEM would take on. Like today, the pressure to reduce benefits led to constant reviews at the Labour Exchange. You could take a lawyer or a friend in to speak for you. We've got a lot of information about what went on in this period from interviews done with a Chopwell couple, George and Phyllis Short. I'll come back to them in a bit more detail in a minute. But here's George on the subject of what happened if you needed somebody to come and represent you at a tribunal. He said, the unemployed couldn't have lawyers. His only friend was the communists or the NUWEM. There was a Labour Party political agent who also did tribunals, but that was very unusual. Generally, trade unionists didn't play any part. Being able to argue the case didn't matter. It was knowing your way around the highly complex system of regulations and payment amounts that counted, and being able to ensure that the whole town knew about any injustice that was being meted out. What they did was they gathered quite often nightly in places like Stockton, for example, where they had a communal cross where they would all meet. And what they did was they shared information about what had happened. They generated anger and a determination to organise to help people who'd been discriminated against. And they trained each other. These gatherings were further education classes, if you like. They produced what George called amateur lawyers. He said it produced amongst the unemployed a whole list of really good amateur lawyers who were really clever at it too. This is George and Phyllis in later life. We've got a picture there of George as a slightly younger man, about the time we're talking about. I'm hoping to be able to get hold of some more pictures of them, but one of the great problems about this period is that we are talking about people who were often desperately poor, and it just didn't have the resources to have lots of photographs taken of themselves. As we go on, I'll try and identify a few faces for you, but it can be a bit hit and miss. Phyllis here, I just love the twinkle in her eyes, had been born in Chopwell at about 1900. We're not exactly certain. She's the daughter of a mining family. George, who was also brought up in the area, went down the pit at the age of 14. And sometime around the age of 16, the pair of them became a couple and married very early. She tells us a lot about the work of the women's sections of the NUWEM, in which she was very active as well. And she gets that there was a real need to provide practical help as well as social and emotional support for people who were suffering so badly from unemployment. She says, the women's section of the NUWEM held little social meetings or went to meetings. There was a real fight for old clothes for jumble sales. We joined together to help women who needed it most, if they were having a baby, for instance. We're dependent on individual women to give us a picture of what was going on in the organisation, because the minutes that they kept give us only the bare bones of who did what. That's why so often I'm going to be referring to Mrs. So-and-so. We just don't have their first names recorded. What comes across from what they have to say is a strong feeling that the impact of unemployment on women, which largely seen in the context of family life, that what was happening in terms of male unemployment was notable because of its effect on the dependents. The women's sections were unusual in telling us about how women tried to actually raise their own issues as well. Lily Webb, who was the organiser I referred to earlier, was initially opposed to the idea of women's sections within the NUWEM because she'd seen them used to sideline debate about women's rights in the Communist Party. Calls for equality of unemployment benefits, for example, fell on deaf ears within the organisation. Maud Brown, who took over from Lily around 1929, rarely got a mention, despite her very high reputation as an effective organizer and somebody who would lead many of the women's contingents. The policies that these women were coming up with sound very modern, strikingly modern to us. They were talking about improved maternity and child welfare services, nursery provision for working mothers, free school meals and clothing. And of course, these were women who understood the need for that very well indeed. This is George and Phyllis's children standing outside their council house in Chopwell. I think it's about 1926. That's Doris on the left there. Doris was a very bright girl, and the problem started for the family when she passed the 11 plus, but they had no money to pay for the clothes that she needed to get to grammar school. The head teacher asked Phyllis, "What are you going to do? She's one of the best." And Phyllis replied, "What am I supposed to do? I've got no money." The head got a coat and a hat from one of the school people, from one of the parents whose children had passed through the following year at the grammar school, and sent Phyllis off to the Board of Guardians to ask for shoes for her. Phyllis says that got her into the grammar school, but it was no wonder that she was a bit of a rebel after a start like that. You've probably heard Chopwell referred to as Little Moscow. The mining village was noted as a hotbed of radical activity at the time, and George and Phyllis were not unusual amongst its population. George took an active part in the coal strikes of 1921 and 1926, which got him blacklisted and prompted his move to Stockton, hoping to find work there. He and Phyllis probably joined the Communist Party about 1926, disillusioned with what the Labour Party and the Independent Labour Party were offering to people in the area in the wake of the lockout and the general strike. Unemployed himself, George became an organiser for the NUWM, and personal shared experience lent an edge to their campaigning. George and Phyllis had 28 shillings a week dole, of which their rent took 12 shillings. Phyllis said a cut of 10% could end up being 20% because of the way the regulations worked. And this was an era when cut after cut was being made in the relief. 10% may not sound a lot, she said, but it was the difference between eating and starvation in those days. Phyllis talks about getting what she called a little job, cleaning floors at the fever hospital. Her wage was £1 a week, and they stopped 9 shillings from George's dole as a result of that. 9 shillings is the equivalent of about 45 pence these days. Doesn't sound much, but it was basically half of Phyllis's wages. Phyllis, of course, was a seasoned campaigner in her own right, starting with attempts to get rationing introduced during World War I. She moved on to fighting for family planning to be made available for working women, though this sometimes puzzled her family. She says, "My mother thought that you'd get some terrible disease if you planned your family, or that your man's health might break down." But Phyllis wasn't afraid to walk into the lion's den. She quite regularly addressed Catholic women's groups on the subject of family planning and contraception, for example. She was on the Women's Hunger March in 1932, part of the 40-strong contingent of women taking place in the main march. There was great difficulty recruiting women to go on these marches because being away from home for so long was a real difficulty. You can imagine arranging for childcare for what might be anything up to 5 weeks, particularly if you didn't have the resources to pay for it, was a bit of a nightmare. The age of the women on the march ranged from 16 to 62, and I think that tells you something. You've got women who are either too young to have family responsibilities yet, or whose children might be grown up and could fend for themselves. But many of these women were political activists, people who could count on a family network of friends and supporters to look after their family for them while they were away. Phyllis described going on the march as being about fighting for something better for our bairns. The marchers took with them a petition with 1 million signatures, calling it an increase in the allowance for children and the abolition of the 26 days waiting time for when you first signed on. In time, those demands would be recognised. On screen at the moment, you've got a picture of some NUWM demonstrations in the area during the 1930s, and also of the 1930 march, marching across the Tyne Bridge on its way through Gateshead to London. And just here, if you can see where my cursor is, I think we have George Short. Can't be absolutely certain because it can be hard to identify from old photographs, but that looks about the closest to the other photographs we have of him from his family. And we know that he was on that march and was one of the leaders, so it wouldn't be surprising to see him in the front there. Phyllis recounted how they didn't march with the men to avoid giving ammunition to a hostile press and to outrage neighbours. These were small communities. She said, "We decided that the women shouldn't march with the men so that there wouldn't be talk in the country that we were, linking up with the men. And then there were the stories that we'd gone on the march, leaving the families for someone else to look after, that it was a damn good time that we were out for, which we proved to them we weren't. The discipline was very strong," she said. "You weren't allowed to have contact with men. You didn't go off for an evening with anybody and have a feed on the sly. There was none of that. And we weren't allowed to go to the pub at all." There are a number of Gateshead women in this picture of the women on the march. It's a bit tentative. We're still in the process of identifying them. But I think that here we have Lily Webb. We've managed to come up with some other photographs of her in other contexts, and that looks remarkably like her. And we think that this is young Phyllis, looking very bright and sparky there. She's very slim, and that's probably not simply the result of her youth and her activity level. We know that about this time, Phyllis had TB and had actually dropped down to about 7 stone. At the back here, I think we have a woman called Maggie Airy that I'm going to be talking to you about later. I've identified her from a picture of her sister, who was also a hunger march, which I'll show you later. And here we have Mrs. Chater, another one of those women for whom we don't have a first name. And I've identified her from this picture, part of a much larger one, of a group of people in Trafalgar Square. We know that Mrs. Chater spoke on the platform at Trafalgar Square, and I think that might be her. But if anybody watching this has photographs of these people or knows them and can identify them, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Really would add so much to our understanding to be able to pin names to faces. There were 40 of these women, and they did 250 miles on foot, 15 miles a day. They were often forced to sleep in workhouses because their perception as communist activists meant that they couldn't always count on support from Labour Party or cooperative guilds along the way. Sometimes they would be able to find supporters who'd arrange a meal for them before they went into the workhouse for the night. Otherwise, it was workhouse fare, a bit of bread or cheese. Sometimes they had nothing at all. Whatever they had would be, during the day, eaten at the side of the road. They'd be very lucky to find shelter along the way. They had no warm clothes or stout shoes. Many of what they had was already pretty battered by the difficulties of their life before they headed off. And you can imagine the impact that 15 miles a day had on shoes that weren't particularly sturdy to start with. At Nottingham, they found a warm reception from workers in a shoe factory who actually threw down new pairs of shoes to them which was gratefully received by many of the women, regardless of whether they were a perfect fit or not. They had a bad time when they got to Trafalgar Square. Police took the petition and locked them up in Charing Cross stations, breaking up meetings in Trafalgar Square. They had 3 weeks at the workhouse in Wandsworth, which was the only place available to them. Phyllis tells us that they got a bowl of skilly in the morning, a doorstep of bread and maybe a bit of cheese. All along the way, they complained about and fought against the treatment that they received at the workhouses. Very often they were treated as what was called casuals, the same as the tramps who wandered the country in those days, going from spike to spike. The condition of the workhouse was that they had to give up all their clothes on coming in so that they could be taken away to be deloused, and that they would then themselves be forced to take a bath, often in front of attendants, and deloused as well. At one workhouse, they were given a pile of blankets, which proved to be lousy, and Phyllis led a deputation of angry women wearing the bright, floppy white nightgowns that they'd been given by the workhouse to go to the manager's office and throw the blankets back at them. They did not accept the treatment lightly, and very often they would stand outside the workhouse arguing for treatment that was considerably better than what was being offered before they'd even come in. The tactic was to keep the workhouse staff up so late that they would finally let them in and treat them like human beings. Washing facilities were very hard to come by. Phyllis recounts one lovely village on their way down, not far from the Nottingham place where they got the shoes, where the women organised for them to sleep in a hall overnight and took away their underthings to wash for them for the next morning. That was something that the women really appreciated. Sometimes you'd find people turning up, organising mini soup kitchens along the way. This is a picture of a group of women who've been greeted in that way, and you can just see the delight of getting hot food and a warmer welcome. That was something that really mattered to them. And if you look at the picture of the woman on the left here, can you see her coat? It was probably skimpy wool to start with. It's obviously very old, very tattered, probably second-hand. It looks as if it's giving way at the seams here. And the shoes, while sensible and low-heeled, are by no means anything like modern walking boots. Even with equipment provided by fundraising drives before the march, this was a cold, hungry, sore business getting down to London. Anywhere where people came out and encouraged you, anywhere where people came out to listen to the meetings that you held each night and to make it clear that they supported you, gave you a sense of your capacity to go on. That public support, again and again, gets mentioned by women as just being incredibly important. They didn't take the confiscation of the petition lightly. They marched on the House of Commons, demanding that the Labour Party MPs did something to get the petition restored. The members of Parliament concerned refused to respond, and the police kicked them down the steps of the House of Commons. Phyllis commented that the only time they weren't separated from the march was when they were all being bruised and battered by the police in exactly the same way. They did try to keep their spirits up with singing along the way. Lily Webb describes shouting slogans about the means test and the Anomalies Act. And another woman remembers chanting, "Work, work, work. We want work and an end to the means test, slave camps and the rest." Carrying packs of 40 pounds and tramping in terrible conditions, the marchers kept up their morale by singing. Trying to survive on 13 shillings and sixpence a week had been very grim. So many of them said that they were actually eating better on the march than they did at home, where very often the temptation was for women to pass on the vast majority of the food to their husbands or their children. especially where reception committees rather than workhouses had let on meals for them. They found themselves eating better than ever before. Singing songs to pass the time was popular. The Internationale was a favourite, but also popular tunes like Who Were You With Last Night? Phyllis's attitude to the police was already ambivalent when she got to London, and what happened down there was going to make things a lot worse. It wasn't unusual, she said, for the police to attempt to bribe an unemployed man in an attempt to infiltrate the NUWM and learn what was going on. They used ridicule to deal with it. The bribes were things like new boots. You were always careful to check out where an unemployed man got such things, because the police were part of the other side. Phyllis was in the NUWM offices when they were raided, and she was carted off with the other members of the delegation and the leader, Wal Hannington. She was released, but others found themselves undergoing prison sentences. The policing of the 32 Hunger March was the catalyst for the creation of what we now call the National Council for Civil Liberties, or Liberty as it's known these days, because of the reaction by the authorities to attempts to deliver the petition. 100,000 people had gathered in Hyde Park to meet the marchers, and amongst them was Liberty's founder, Ronald Kidd. He was so disgusted by what he saw, the way that thousands of police officers, some of them mounted, were mobilized against the protest. He described violent clashes erupting in the park and spreading rapidly through central London, leaving many marchers seriously injured. And in particular, Kidd witnessed police agents provocateurs, disguised as workers, attempting to incite violence amongst peaceful protesters. Over the following year, Kidd worked to raise awareness of the threat to peaceful protest. And ahead of the next Hunger March in February 1934, he actually gathered a number of eminent people together to form the National Council for Civil Liberties. From the autumn of 1933, plans were made for another national march. This time, the demands, apart from the issue of the mean test, also focused around rights for employed people, like a 7-hour day. The march was led by Mrs. Chater from Gateshead, whose husband had been unemployed for 4 years. It's recorded that she was a very effective speaker who'd led many a local struggle. This, I think, is her on the platform. This is her on the march. She addressed a number of meetings along the way on the 1932 march, very often meetings organised by the Co-op Women's Guild, of which she seems to have been an active member. Although she'd only been active in the NUWM for a short time, she seems to have got started on public speaking along the way. It's obviously been a kind of training school for her. Her husband, Alf, who was also a political activist, had been unemployed for 4 years. Her friends were pretty amused by her new role, and she told her audiences that she'd only gradually been able to win them round, as they came to realise that she was right in saying that it was only through struggling that working people could gain anything at all. There's a wonderful special branch report about her when she took to the platform in Trafalgar Square at the end of the 32 march. They said that she spoke about her own experiences as a way of connecting with the audience. She told them that she was the mother of 5 children and added that she'd never before spoken from such a public platform. She gave them, the report says, 1 or 2 emotional stories about the condition of children in the unemployed areas of Tyneside, and said nothing of interest to this department. She'd clearly found her feet, though. We hear of her speaking regularly at local meetings over the next year. In 1933, the NUWM organised a county-wide hunger march to protest at the administration of the means test in County Durham. Wearing a vivid red tam o' shanter, were told that she jumped onto the back of the lorry to address a crowd before heading into County Hall to negotiate with the council. Meantime, there were clashes outside between police and protesters that ended with 18 arrests. One of them, her husband, Alf, he ended up receiving a jail sentence. Another woman who took part in the 32 march, which I think is Maggie Airy here, was also a Gateshead campaigner. She turns up acting on behalf of the Chopwell United Front Committee, leading a small march to a meeting of a relief committee being held in Blaydon. And Maggie speaks to that committee, explaining that it was common for women, including her, to have rent problems. She said that the trouble with them is that they sit within their four walls and keep their troubles to themselves. Whereas if they'd get out onto the streets and advertise the fact, they might get a little more support, especially from those who are supposed to represent them. County Durham, with its Labour-controlled council, had invoked the Act for the Feeding of Necessitous School Children to provide meals for school children during the lockout of 1926. And we know that Maggie was very active during that period. In October, she reported that Blaydon Council was serving 13,000 meals a week to school children, plus nursing and expectant mothers. She's clearly a very practical woman as well as a good organiser. She talked about shoes and clothing being sent by comrades in the Women's Cooperative Guilds and about making up maternity bundles locally for women who couldn't claim from the National Women's Relief Committee Fund because that was only intended for minors' families. She said, "The women are working splendidly in Blaydon, and I would urge women all over the country to get into this work of agitating for the feeding of the children." It's one of the striking things about the women in the NUWM and on the marches, the way that they think about whole families and about the way that you need to look after the whole family and issues that are seen as particular to women if you're to improve things for everybody. Maggie's younger sister Olive would take part in the 1936 march. I think that's her in the middle of this picture of them coming back from, they got a train back from London. This is a picture of them at Central Station, which you may recognise here. Maggie and Olive look so much alike that I've identified Maggie in the previous photograph from this image of Olive. But if anybody has information about these women and can put me right, I'd be delighted to hear about it. Olive had been given boots and clothing by the Cooperative Women's Guild, possibly organised at the behest of her sister. She looks as if she's reasonably warm there, and it's rather nice to see because the conditions on the way down for this march were no kinder than for the previous ones. After 1936, the NUWM declined from a mass movement to a pressure group. That was because unemployment was starting to fall as Britain rearmed. And of course, the Communist Party became involved in the opposition to fascism at home and abroad, moving attention away from the NUWM. The organisation was wound up after the end of the war, as there was felt to be little unemployment with the economy growing. But the women who'd been involved in this did not give up their work. We last hear of Phyllis in the 1980s, still fighting alongside George, this time for the rights of pensioners, and a very effective struggle it was. But that's a story for another day. Thank you very much for listening. We're going to take a short break now, and then we'll be taking live questions and answers. So if you've got anything that you'd like to ask me, please do. And if you've got any information about any of the people I've spoken about, or anybody else you know who was involved during this period, we'd just love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Heritage Hour with Gateshead Archive. Big apologies that we started so very late tonight. Facebook was not our friend and it didn't want to let us do anything. We're still broadcasting from our homes because council buildings aren't sort of open as late as they were. So thank you for bearing with us. A big thank you to Rosie. Thanks, Rosie. As ever, we've learned a huge amount there. As you probably know, Rosie's a local historian, an author and a researcher, and joins us regularly on Heritage Hour. And she's here now to take your questions. And we really do want to hear more about those women. So if anyone does have any information, you can message us through Facebook, send us an email to the main library's email address, libraries@gateshead.gov.uk. So thank you, Rosie. So much information there. That just a huge range I didn't know, and I'm sure lots of people didn't even know hunger marches kind of had been around really from the turn of the century. So kind of just think about that main Jarrow March and what happened afterwards. But there was obviously kind of a tradition going on there for quite a while.
I think was one of the big surprises that there had been, my picture is slightly out of sync. Sorry if this looks a bit weird, folks. Hopefully you can hear me okay, though.
Yes, I think.
Great. Yeah, it was one of the big surprises. I don't think I'd realised how early it had started or how far it had been a mass movement. You know, back in 1905, you actually get thousands of people marching. It's the build up to a period of great labour unrest in the period running up until the beginning of the First World War, which is really when things start to calm down. And I think it's those issues about food and hunger, particularly child hunger, that really motivate people to just get so active.
Yeah, this is really mobilizing people because this is your family. These are your children starving and not having enough food. These are basic things that people need to survive, and that obviously will mobilize people. But yeah, a lot going on in Gateshead. 200 women coming together, which I didn't know about. That's quite an achievement.
Yeah, and not all from Chopwell. I've just noticed a comment coming in there.
Yes, from Gemma, is it?
Yes, lots of people were conducting hunger marches at the same time. I'm assuming, Gemma, that you mean countries rather than counties. There is certainly a massive hunger march movement in the United States. And there they were turning out people by the thousand. And in a country that had far less of a radical tradition than Britain did at the time, the number of people who were politically active as a percentage of the population was far smaller. It's quite remarkable how many you saw. But what I think I particularly like about the people in our area who were engaged in this was that they had such a sense of how local conditions mattered as much as national ones. And it's quite interesting. A lot of their achievements are actually local. The attempts to change things like the means test at national level are not terribly successful. But locally, they managed to prevent wholesale evictions. If you could get into a house where somebody was being chucked out and kind of hold the bailiffs at bay until sunset, you could stop the family being thrown out. And they were involved in doing things as practical and as individual as that.
Wow, so it's real grassroots stuff that they're kind of aiming high nationally, but at least they're changing lives in the local area. What struck me was just like the practicalities of, organising the march. I didn't realize sort of how much, I guess I've always seen it as quite a respectable march, not kind of rioting. And obviously it was a massive thorn in the side of the government, to put as an understatement, but quite a lot of rules around the women not mixing and not going out and not eating with the men, to really keep it on that level.
Yeah. They wanted to make sure that they had the support of their neighbours, that people remained involved up here because they felt that this was something that the rest of the community would feel okay about. And they were also very conscious of how their family would react. People like Phyllis was not unusual in having a mother who thought she was perhaps going a bit over the top with some of her ideas. And you needed to make sure that you didn't put people off and make them feel that this was a bunch of crazy protesters rather than people who actually had a good point they were making and who were trying to change things.
Yeah, that's it. It's really interesting. And I mean, I guess there were lots of rules around kind of mining families and being respectable and behaving in a certain way, but that really carried them and made that march very impactful and kind of gave it that reputation of being done right. It was really interesting about hearing. I didn't realize they needed to sleep somewhere, but the women slept in workhouses on the way. Crikey, that's must have been an experience. Even when you come in from poverty, it's a different a whole different level doing that.
Of course, it's something that people dreaded.
Some
years ago I worked with older people, and I can remember people who were reluctant to go into hospital, particularly the General Hospital in Newcastle, because they associated it with the workhouse. They thought if they went in, they'd never come out.
Crikey. I've heard that about the Bentham Hospital, that it was a maternity ward, maybe. And people were just horrified at the thought that they were going to the workhouse. I mean, they weren't, but that association, it was people's worst fear, wasn't it, that you just wouldn't come out again?
Exactly. And it kind of gives you a sense of how desperate they were that they would accept that accommodation. There were men on the way who also made use of the workhouse facilities, but by and large, it was a lot easier for the men's groups to find accommodation in local village halls or church halls, partly because they were perceived as being tougher and more willing to sleep in a pretty rough environment, but also because there was a bit of suspicion of the women, precisely because there were women. What were they doing leaving their children behind and gallivanting off like this?
Okay. And where else did they sleep, or did they just really have to rely on places like the workhouse, or do we know where they
weren't able to do anything else because they didn't have enough money for B&Bs, for example, or the sort of accommodation that we might use these days. And if you were a single woman turning up at the door of a boarding house and asking for accommodation for the night, you would get people asking questions about what you were doing.
That would not be approved of, shall we say?
Yeah,
lots of comments. People saying really interesting. Learned a lot. We've got another question. Were they ever turned away from the workhouses because of the march?
Okay, the workhouses were not legally allowed to turn people away if they could prove that they were actually, what's the word I'm looking for, indigent. But they could make it so uncomfortable that they wouldn't want to stay. The stories that they tell about the 3-week-long stay in Wandsworth in London in 1932 make it very clear that the authorities were trying to get them to go, and just making it so unpleasant an experience that they would simply leave and go somewhere else, which of course they couldn't. They had nowhere else to go.
Yeah, it must have been just so terrifying to think, we've committed, we're halfway down the country, we can't just get a bus home, we're in this now, we have to see it through. Hard to think what thoughts must have been going through their head, just so determined.
Absolutely. And so desperate.
Yeah.
I think that picture where you can see the ripped seam of the coat kind of sums it up for me. They were coming from places where they had absolutely nothing. And if they were going to make life better for their children, then they had to try whatever was available to them. It's very clear when you read the interviews with Phyllis that she is really determined that things will be better for the next generation. She doesn't actually expect that much for herself.
Okay.
She's accepted that it's going to take a long time to change things. But the lengths that she goes through to get Doris into the grammar school, for example, are extraordinary.
Wow. I guess that's all they had, the thought that things would be better for their children. I'm just having a look at the comments here. Yeah, lots of positive feedback, Rosie.
That's nice.
I can't imagine walking that far just in everyday shoot. Like, I can't imagine walking that far in normal, in trainers and walking gear, but to walk just like in a pair of old leather shoes and a wool coat that would never have dried out, and not, nothing would have dried out. It just, it must have been so difficult.
And it must have been so depressing. I think that's why the issue of morale was so important. If you're wandering along with blisters, if you've got cramps, if you're cold and you're wet and you haven't eaten properly for 24 hours, just having somebody turning up at the side of the road to cheer you on is going to be helpful. Yeah. Never mind having a group of other women turning up with some hot soup. There's a kind of the importance of people approving of you and of saying that this is something worth doing and that they're going to join in some way. That makes it possible to keep going.
And did people join them on the way? Sorry if I've missed that in the
No, a few people did, but it wasn't uncommon for people to march with them for a short distance.
Okay.
So you would get local women coming along and walking with them to the next town or the next village. People who couldn't take time away from their own lives, but wanted to show that they did actually think this was a good idea. And of course, you get all those people who turn up in London when they get there, because that 100,000 are all locals coming in on top of the marchers arriving in Hyde Park.
Yeah, quite a crowd.
There's a great photograph of people lining the road as they march into London with banners saying things like, "Welcome the women."
Oh, wow.
So they've turned out to kind of receive them as they come in.
That's amazing. And quite shocking to hear about the police sort of positioned within the crowd to try and turn it violent and obviously undermine the cause, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there will have been some people involved in the march who were quite ready to get in there and get their fists flying. I'm not saying these are all completely peaceful, but Kidd, who talks about these agents provocateurs, produces quite a lot of evidence about why they could not have been marchers. They are not members of any group. None of the people around them can identify them, and people kept in their own groups. And they're just better dressed than the people.
Right, okay.
They've got sturdy shoes on. In particular, a lot of them are wearing policeman's boots, and those are very distinctive and very recognisable.
So they haven't worked on their undercover outfits as a bit of a giveaway.
Not as well as they might
have
done.
I like it.
But it wasn't unusual. George Short tells this wonderful story about when you were organising a meeting, you couldn't afford to get posters printed, so you chalked the details on the pavement. And he's busy doing this one day, telling people about a meeting that's happening the following evening. And then this voice from behind him tells him that he spelt something wrong. And he turns around and it's his personal policeman. It's the guy who's been following him for days. And he just can't hold off. You spelled that wrong.
The grammar police are literally around.
Yeah,
exactly. Crikey. Interesting as well about them. People saying they were eating better than at home. The women, I've sort of heard that before from soldiers who were conscripted, saying that they were getting a better meal in the ward than they'd ever had at home.
It was the First World War, wasn't it, where lots of people joined up who'd been living in very straitened circumstances beforehand. And the average difference in height between a working man and an officer was about 6 inches.
Wow.
Just the effect of long-term malnutrition on height and build.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for women, it'll be a lot worse, because they sacrifice food for the rest of the family.
Yeah, quite shocking. Just a total change for them to be able to just, I guess that'd be the first time in their adult lives they'd be focusing on themselves and what they were going to eat. And I mean, and I guess element of it would be exciting, escaping domestic drudgery. And although it was hard, it's probably the only adventure they ever got to have.
Yeah. And it must have been a relief in some ways, like Mrs. Chater undoubtedly loved her children.
Yeah.
But can you imagine leaving 5 kids behind for 5 weeks?
Yeah.
They
must have had those, just as you said, just family networks who were there to support them. But I guess people had closer families and bigger families, more siblings who could possibly help. But quite a feat organising childcare.
Yeah.
For that long. I can't see any more comments, Rosie, but lots of positive feedback. And
that's great.
Thank you so much for joining us and bearing with all of the technical difficulties. Do join us next week, everyone, when Richard Pears will be telling us all about country houses of northeast England. So good night to you all, and thank you very much again, Rosie.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for bearing with us. Bye.